Bernie Sanders' voice echoed through the Budget Committee chamber as he called Lauren Boebert an enemy of working families and claimed she doesn't understand how socialism can create equality. Sanders' progressive base loved these moments of anti-capitalist fury, but he had picked the wrong target this time. Boebert had been waiting for this moment, armed with Sanders' real estate records, book deal millions, and hypocritical lifestyle. What happened next would expose Sanders as the ultimate fake socialist and end his revolutionary credibility forever. The Senate Budget Committee hearing room was packed with tension on this cold March morning in Washington. The formal chamber, with its marble columns and ornate ceiling, had witnessed countless debates over fiscal policy throughout the decades. But what was about to unfold would become one of the most explosive confrontations between capitalism and socialism in congressional history. The hearing was supposed to focus on budget priorities and wealth inequality, topics that Bernie Sanders had made his political trademark for over 3 decades. As the ranking member of the committee, Sanders had used this platform countless times to rail against the billionaire class, corporate greed, and the failures of capitalism to provide for working families. Sanders sat at his position with a familiar intensity that had made him a progressive icon. His white hair was characteristically disheveled, his suit rumpled in that studied way that suggested he was too focused on fighting for justice to worry about appearances. His thick Brooklyn accent and animated gestures had become synonymous with American socialism, and his finger-pointing had become as famous as his revolutionary rhetoric. Lauren Boebert had been invited to participate in the joint hearing as a representative voice on fiscal conservatism and small business perspectives. She sat quietly at the witness table, wearing a simple navy suit, her demeanor professional but alert. Her presence in this particular hearing was notable because it represented a direct confrontation between two fundamentally different visions of American economic policy. The committee had been hearing testimony from various economists and policy experts about wealth distribution, tax policy, and social programs. The usual suspects had offered their usual perspectives, think tank representatives had shared their research, and academic economists had presented their models and projections. That's when Sanders decided to make his move. He had been waiting for the right moment to deploy his signature socialist rhetoric, and he sensed an opportunity when the discussion turned to tax policy and its impact on working families versus wealthy individuals and corporations. "Mr. Chairman," Sanders began, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly intensity that had made him famous, "I think we need to address the fundamental dishonesty that characterizes so much of a discussion about economic policy in this country today." He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes blazing with a kind of righteous indignation that had fueled his political career for decades. "We have people in this room and throughout our government who represent the interests of the billionaire class while pretending to care about working families. We have representatives who advocate for policies that make the rich richer while working people struggle to put food on the table." The familiar themes were emerging, and Democratic committee members were leaning forward with anticipation. They had seen Sanders deploy this strategy countless times before, using populist rhetoric to paint Republicans as defenders of wealth and privilege against the interests of ordinary Americans. Sanders' gaze began to settle on Boebert, and everyone in the room could sense that this was about to become personal. "We have representatives who don't understand how wealth inequality is destroying the fabric of our society, who don't comprehend how capitalism has failed millions of American families, who refuse to acknowledge that socialist policies are the only path to real economic justice." The attack was building in intensity, and Sanders was clearly preparing to make Boebert the target of his revolutionary fervor. This wasn't going to be a general policy critique. This was going to be a targeted assault designed to expose what Sanders saw as the fundamental callousness of conservative economic policy. "Representative Boebert," Sanders said, his voice rising with indignation, his signature finger beginning to point in her direction. "You sit there advocating for tax cuts for the wealthy, for deregulation that benefits corporations, for policies that protect the billionaire class while working families suffer." The accusation was direct and personal, and the room fell silent as Sanders prepared to deliver what he clearly believed would be a devastating blow to conservative economic philosophy. "You are an enemy of working families," Sanders declared, his voice echoing through the chamber with revolutionary fury. "And you don't understand how socialism can create equality, how wealth redistribution can lift people out of poverty, how government programs can provide the security and opportunity that capitalism has failed to deliver." He leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of someone who had just delivered a knockout punch, his fingers still pointing at Boebert like an accusation made flesh. "The American people are tired of representatives who serve the billionaire class instead of the working class, who protect corporate profits instead of human dignity, who defend a system that has created the greatest wealth inequality in modern history." The room was electric with tension, and Sanders clearly believed he had just scored a major political victory. He had used his signature style to paint Boebert as a defender of economic injustice, and he expected her to either remain silent or offer some weak defense that would only make his attack look stronger. But what Sanders didn't realize was that he had just made the same mistake that had destroyed so many other establishment politicians who had underestimated Lauren Boebert. He had assumed that his revolutionary rhetoric and progressive credentials would be enough to intimidate someone he clearly viewed as an intellectual inferior. What Sanders didn't know was that Boebert had been doing her homework, researching Sanders' own lifestyle, his wealth accumulation, his real estate holdings, and his sources of income. Sanders had just accused someone who had actually lived in poverty of serving the billionaire class, while hiding his own millionaire status behind a facade of socialist concern. "Mr. Chairman," Boebert said, her voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel that made everyone in the room pay attention, "I'd like to respond to the accusations that Senator Sanders has just made against me." The chairman nodded, and Boebert stood up slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. She didn't look angry or defensive. She looked like someone who had been handed an opportunity to expose something important. "Thank you, Bernie," Boebert said, her voice carrying across the room with unmistakable authority, "for that passionate defense of working families and your concern about wealth inequality. I'm particularly impressed by your commitment to socialist principles and your opposition to the accumulation of private wealth." She paused, letting her words sink in, her gaze steady and unwavering. "But I have to ask you something, and I think everyone in this room would be interested in your answer. How exactly do you reconcile your socialist principles with your own personal wealth accumulation?" The question hit the room like a thunderbolt, and Sanders' confident expression began to falter slightly. But Boebert was just getting started. "You see, Bernie, while you've been lecturing me about serving the billionaire class, I've been looking at your own financial situation. And what I found is absolutely fascinating. According to your own financial disclosures, you're worth approximately $3 million. That puts you in the top 1% of Americans, the same group you spend so much time attacking." The data was beginning to flow, and everyone in the room could sense that something significant was about to be revealed. Sanders sat rigid in his chair, his revolutionary confidence suddenly looking much less secure. $3 million, Bernie," Boebert repeated, letting the number sink in. "That's more wealth than 99% of the working families you claim to represent will ever see in their lifetimes. How exactly does that square with your socialist principles?" She pulled out a document from her folder. "But it gets even better. Let's talk about your real estate empire. Yes, that's right. The socialist senator from Vermont owns not one, not two, but 3 houses. 3 houses, Bernie. Most working families struggle to afford one." The revelation was devastating, and the room fell into stunned silence. Here was Sanders, the champion of wealth redistribution, revealed as a multimillionaire with a real estate portfolio that most Americans could only dream of. "Let me break this down for everyone," Boebert continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. "House number 1. Your primary residence in Burlington, Vermont, worth approximately $405,000. House number 2. Your home in Washington, D.C., worth about $489,000. And house number 3. Your lakefront vacation home in North Hero, Vermont, purchased for $575,000. She looked around the committee room, making eye contact with other members. That's $1.5 million in real estate alone, not counting the appreciation in value. Most working families don't have $1.5 million in total assets, but our socialist senator owns that much just in vacation properties and second homes. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Here was Sanders, the supposed enemy of wealth accumulation, revealed as someone who had accumulated significant wealth while preaching about the evils of capitalism. "You called me an enemy of working families," Boebert continued, her voice taking on a tone of genuine incredulity. "But let's talk about what working families actually face. The median household income in America is about $70,000 a year. That means it would take the average American family over 40 years just to earn what you have in real estate alone." She began walking around the room, her energy commanding everyone's attention. "I understand working families because I was one. I worked in restaurants, I struggled to pay bills, I built a business from nothing while you were accumulating millions of dollars and multiple properties." The room was completely captivated now. This wasn't just a policy debate anymore. This was a fundamental confrontation between authentic working-class experience and performative socialism. "But here's what really bothers me about your hypocrisy, Bernie," Boebert said, her voice rising with conviction. "You didn't just inherit this wealth. You didn't win the lottery. You made this money by participating in the exact capitalist system you claim to oppose. You made millions from book deals, speaking fees, and investments. You're literally a capitalist success story masquerading as a socialist revolutionary." The accusation was devastating because it highlighted the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Sanders' political brand. How could someone who had benefited so dramatically from capitalism credibly advocate for its replacement with socialism? "Let's talk about those book deals," Boebert continued, pulling out another document. "Your book, Our Revolution, earned you over $1 million in royalties. Your follow-up books have earned you additional millions. You've made more money from selling books about fighting capitalism than most capitalists make from their businesses." She stopped directly across from Sanders, her gaze intense and unwavering. "So when you lecture me about serving the billionaire class, remember that you've made your millions by selling books to people who believe in your anti-capitalist message. When you attack me for supporting business-friendly policies, remember that you've built your wealth through the same market mechanisms you claim to oppose." The distinction was crucial, and everyone in the room understood it. There was a fundamental difference between advocating for economic policies and living by the principles those policies supposedly represented. "You want to know what's really insulting about your approach?" Boebert asked, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "You've spent decades convincing working families that socialism is the answer to their problems, while you've been getting rich off the capitalist system. You've been selling them a dream of wealth redistribution while accumulating wealth for yourself." The room was completely silent now, everyone absorbing the devastating exposure of Sanders' hypocrisy. This wasn't just about policy differences anymore. This was about the fundamental authenticity of Sanders' socialist brand. "Let me tell you what real socialism looks like," Boebert continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had actually researched the topic. "Real socialism is Venezuela, where people are eating zoo animals because the economy has collapsed. Real socialism is Cuba, where people risk their lives on rafts to escape to capitalist America. Real socialism is the Soviet Union, where millions died from government-created famines." She began pacing now, her energy filling the room. "But you don't want to talk about real socialism, do you, Bernie? You want to talk about your fantasy version where government controls everything, but somehow you get to keep your 3 houses and your millions of dollars." The attack was devastating because it highlighted the disconnect between Sanders' rhetoric and both his personal lifestyle and the historical reality of socialist systems. "You called me an enemy of working families," Boebert said, her voice reaching a crescendo. "But I actually came from a working family. I actually built something from nothing. I actually understand what it's like to struggle because I've lived it, not because I've studied it from the comfort of a lakefront vacation home." She pulled out her phone and showed a photo to the committee. "This is your vacation home in North Hero, Vermont. Lakefront property, private beach, stunning views. This is where you retreat to write books about how capitalism has failed working families. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. The visual evidence was powerful, showing the stark contrast between Sanders' socialist rhetoric and his capitalist lifestyle. How could someone who owned a lakefront vacation home credibly claim to understand the struggles of families who couldn't afford basic necessities? But here's what really exposes your hypocrisy, Boebert continued, her voice taking on a tone of righteous indignation. You bought this vacation home right after the 2016 election, when your campaign was supposedly about fighting against the wealthy elite. You used money from your political celebrity to buy a luxury property while telling your supporters that private wealth was evil. The timing was particularly damaging because it showed Sanders using his political platform for personal enrichment rather than living by the principles he advocated. You want to talk about wealth inequality? Boebert asked, her voice growing stronger. Let's talk about the inequality between your lifestyle and the lifestyle of the people who donate to your campaigns. Let's talk about the working families who send you $27 donations while you're buying lakefront vacation homes. She looked around the committee room, making eye contact with each member. Those donors think they're supporting a revolutionary who lives modestly and fights for economic justice. Instead, they're funding the luxury lifestyle of a millionaire who preaches socialism while practicing capitalism. The betrayal of Sanders' supporters was a particularly powerful theme because it highlighted how his hypocrisy hurt the very people he claimed to represent. And let's talk about your impact on young people, Boebert continued, her voice taking on a tone of genuine concern. You've convinced an entire generation that capitalism is evil, that success is immoral, that wealth creation is somehow wrong. Meanwhile, you've been creating wealth, accumulating assets, and living a capitalist lifestyle. She stopped and faced Sanders directly. You've done more damage to young Americans' understanding of economics than any conservative ever could. You've taught them to hate the system that could actually improve their lives, while you've been prospering under that same system. The accusation was particularly powerful because it highlighted the broader social damage caused by Sanders' hypocritical messaging. How many young Americans had been discouraged from pursuing economic success because of Sanders' anti-capitalist rhetoric. Let me tell you what I learned from actually living under capitalism, Boebert said, her voice reflecting both gratitude and determination. I learned that hard work can pay off. I learned that taking risks can lead to rewards. I learned that building something valuable can create opportunities not just for yourself, but for others. She gestured toward Sanders. I learned that in America, someone from a working-class background can build a business, create jobs, and achieve success through determination and effort. That's not exploitation, Bernie. That's opportunity. That's the American dream that you're trying to convince people to reject. The contrast between Sanders' rhetoric and American reality was stark and undeniable. While Sanders preached about the failures of capitalism, millions of Americans continued to improve their lives through entrepreneurship, hard work, and economic freedom. But you don't want people to understand that, do you? Boebert asked, her voice becoming more pointed. Because if working families understood that capitalism creates opportunities for advancement, they might not need the government programs that give politicians like you power and influence. The political calculation behind Sanders' socialism was being exposed, revealing it as a means of maintaining political relevance rather than genuinely helping working families. You've built your entire career on convincing people that they're victims of an unfair system, Boebert continued, while you've been succeeding wildly under that same system. You've made millions telling people that millions are impossible to make honestly. She pulled out another document. Speaking of honest wealth creation, let's talk about your wife's role in this empire. Jane Sanders was paid $200,000 per year plus benefits as president of Burlington College. That's in addition to your Senate salary. Your household was bringing in over $300,000 per year while you were telling working families that they were being exploited by wealthy people. The revelation about Jane Sanders added another layer to the hypocrisy, showing that the entire Sanders family had been benefiting from high-income positions while advocating for wealth redistribution. So when you call me an enemy of working families, Boebert said, her voice carrying the weight of undeniable evidence, remember that my family actually was a working family. When you lecture me about understanding struggle, remember that you've been making hundreds of thousands of dollars while I was making minimum wage. When you attack me for defending capitalism, remember that you've made millions under the capitalist system you claim to oppose. The room remained silent for a long moment, the weight of the revelations settling over everyone present. Sanders sat motionless, his revolutionary facade completely shattered by the weight of evidence about his own hypocrisy. You want to know what a real champion of working families looks like? Boebert asked, her voice rising with conviction. It's not someone who makes millions preaching socialism while living like a capitalist. It's not someone who owns 3 houses while telling people that private property is theft. It's not someone who gets rich selling books about fighting the rich. She looked around the committee room one final time. A real champion of working families is someone who actually came from working families. Someone who understands struggle because they've lived it. Someone who supports the economic system that creates opportunities because they've personally benefited from those opportunities. The distinction was clear and powerful. Authentic representation versus performative politics. Real experience versus theoretical rhetoric. Genuine concern versus calculated positioning. I didn't come to Congress to convince people they're victims, Boebert continued, her voice reflecting both humility and strength. I came here to protect the opportunities that allowed me to succeed, to defend the system that rewards hard work and innovation, to ensure that other working families have the same chances I had. She began gathering her papers, but her final words would echo in that room long after the hearing was over. So, Bernie, the next time you want to call someone an enemy of working families, maybe you should look in the mirror. The next time you want to lecture someone about wealth inequality, maybe you should explain your 3 houses to the families living paycheck to paycheck. And the next time you want to promote socialism, maybe you should try living like a socialist instead of like a millionaire capitalist. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Sanders sat rigid in his chair, his socialist credibility completely destroyed by the exposure of his capitalist lifestyle. His signature finger-pointing and revolutionary rhetoric had been turned against him, revealing the hollow hypocrisy at the core of his political brand. Other committee members began to stir, some nodding slightly, others staring at their notes, processing what they had just witnessed. This hadn't been just a policy debate. This had been a fundamental education in the difference between authentic advocacy and performative politics. The confrontation between Bernie Sanders and Lauren Boebert had exposed something crucial about modern American socialism. It was largely a movement led by wealthy elites who benefited from capitalism while convincing others to reject it. It had highlighted the danger of trusting politicians who didn't live by the principles they advocated. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that all the revolutionary rhetoric in the world couldn't overcome the simple truth that authenticity mattered more than ideology, that personal example trumped political slogans, and that voters deserved leaders who actually lived the values they claimed to represent. The age of unquestioned socialist rhetoric was over. The age of demanding consistency between political advocacy and personal behavior had begun. And it had started with a former restaurant owner from Colorado who had the courage to challenge a millionaire senator from Vermont with the most powerful weapon in politics: the truth about how he really lived.